You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. Michael Kaufman and I grabbed brunch on Sunday, and after we indulged in some breakfast quesadillas and iced coffee, we recorded this episode. Enjoy. Let's start with Sumy.
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple main directions, but Sumy remains one of them. After Ukrainian forces were forced to withdraw from Kursk, the Russian military kept pushing, and they've established a thin buffer north of Sumy, maybe around 200 square kilometers. And they were pushing there pretty hard in May and June, but it looks like, at least for now, the Russian push north of Sumy has culminated. Things there have stabilized a bit. Still remains a priority for them, just looking at the kind of units the Russian military has arrayed north of Sumy. Sumy remains an important sector to watch. There's some activity up and around Kharkiv, especially kind of north of Kupiansk. You still see Russian forces pushing northeast of Liman in this kind of forest area. But then a lot of the focus remains the same places where you've seen fighting in 24-23. Donetsk, you have Russian military trying to create two big pockets, one around Konstantinovka, by trying to press between that city and Pokrovsk. You've seen gains most recently in May and June, essentially turning both of them into salients. And particularly the last months, you've seen the Russian military pushing more southwest of Pokrovsk and starting to enter Dnipropetrovsk region in the southern part of Donetsk. So the short summary is that you're looking at largely the same fronts. There may be more activity in Kharkiv, maybe not, but intensity really picked up starting from March in the spring and is likely to go all the way through the summer and into the fall.
How much of this for Russia, this picking up of intensity that started back in March that you just alluded to, how much of that was due to changing weather conditions versus more manpower opening up for Russia versus success in equipping more effectively on the Russian side? What really drove it? Or was it a mixture of all these factors?
So the winter was definitely a factor, but my own view is that the main thing that stalled Russian offensive operations last year is they exhausted themselves over the course of the fall, given the casualties and material losses, and they needed time to reconstitute. And it's clear that they began pushing again starting from, if not late February, certainly in March. Second part is they've also been trying to adapt to the Ukrainian military's very wise investment in expanding drone units and focusing on the drone component of the fight, which was really stalling Russian advances and making them pay a high price for any territory they gain. So Russian counter-adaptation focused on long-range fiber optic cable drones, trying to invest much more in the positional component of the fight, right? Trying to attack the rear of the Ukrainian military and trying to isolate logistics and ground lines of communication. And the second part was, of course, trying to reduce their equipment losses. You see Russian military has been making more gains this year than last year, but is using a lot less armored fighting vehicles.
When you say reducing their equipment losses, does that mean by employing them differently or just using, as you mentioned, fewer?
Just using fewer and instead using more motorcycles, ATVs, and the like. And the first people laughed at it because certainly in the West, we wouldn't accept the casualties that come from these sort of light motorized tactics. But they're not as effective because the Ukrainian military optimized for defense against mechanized attack. In truth, it's not clear that these motorcycle tactics do any worse or more poorly than a traditional attack with armored fighting vehicles. And Russians use a mix of the two.
Are they using them just to get soldiers closer to the front?
Primarily, yeah.
So it's more about mobility in the immediate rear area?
No, B.A. Freeman coined it, I think, somewhat accurately as dragoon tactics. They are using it to move units up. And the reason they're doing that is because if they can overcome that 0 to 15 kilometer defeat zone imposed by Ukrainian drones and traditional fires and mines, then they can potentially anchor in.
So they are used in actually advancing on the front.
Right, but there isn't much in the way of encounters in that respect between infantry because Ukraine has a very low density of forces at the front line. And so part of the reason that tactic can be effective is once they anchor in, there's nobody to counterattack them, to push them out. That makes sense? And they also understand that the amount of infantry holding lines on both sides, but particularly the Ukrainian side, is very low. The force density is very low relative to terrain.
How has Ukraine responded to these tactics? When we last spoke, which was some months ago, at least on the show, we speak all the time, but I remember we talked about how Ukraine had sort of set up this concept of defensive operations, we can call it, that adapted to their insufficient manpower and using drones on the defensive.
Line of drones.
Yeah. And it sounds like what you're describing with this use of higher mobility, small vehicles, ATVs, and motorcycles is a response to that, to try to overwhelm that system. What kind of counter adaptations are we now seeing from Ukraine on the defensive?
So the Ukrainian approach kind of had a triangle of mines and prepared defense, which canalized the attack, right? And then you have drones and high density coverage by drone units, essentially isolating parts of the front line. And then you had traditional fires, mortars, artillery. And together, the three of them worked and allowed Ukraine to hold terrain with very few troops on the actual line. And so the Russian military has been trying to counter adapt to that. And I won't say they've been successful, but Ukrainian units seeing the motorcycle tactics are now focusing on having a much higher rate of coverage in terms of first person view drones ready to take on a large group of attacking motorcycles as opposed to what would have been, let's say, a reinforced mechanized company. Secondarily, there are different types of barriers and different sort of things you can build to deal with motorcycles as opposed to which you would set up to deal with armored fighting vehicles. Lastly, to some extent, it's been effective. I don't think that's the main issue for the Ukrainian military. The main issue for the Ukrainian military is long-range fiber optic cable drones, which operate 20 to 25 kilometers behind the front line, and expansion of drone units on the Russian side, Rubicon and what have you, who focus on targeting Ukrainian drone units, right? And so the Ukrainian military has to evolve ways of protecting the rear, entrenching at a much greater depth, and now taking all those support components that you would consider to be the rear that previously were relatively safe and operating very differently and entrenching differently with these units.
Before you get into that, we were talking before we started recording about earlier in the war, even just 6 months ago, you could get within 10 kilometers of the front and be reasonably confident that you're going to be all right.
Yeah, fairly easily.
But now that's just not the case anymore.
It isn't. It changes things for sure. That's been the way the war's gone, over the course of the last 3 years. There was a time where you could get right up to the front, and then it started being closed off by drones.
And the greater range of these fiber optic cable drones is really the issue here.
Right. At the tactical level, it's a real challenge. And it's a real challenge for logistical sustainment. So, of course, you can resupply your forward units with heavy multi-rotor drones, drop them their key essentials. But now when you have fiber optic cable drones operating at this range, no vehicle is safe because these drones are essentially one-way attacks. So the operator, if he doesn't have a target, he won't mind wasting the drone on any vehicle he sees.
Yeah, like a pickup truck or a...
Absolutely. Anything at all. So it doesn't matter to him. They're not getting the drone back. And so that poses a slightly different type of challenge. You've seen all sorts of things from trying to net in entire roads to just changing how the force operates or trying to find ways to actually target the operators' fiber optic cable drones. But it's not easy. And I've heard people proudly pronounce months ago that, yes, there will be a solution to it. I don't think there will be at least I don't see an obvious solution yet. Maybe my views on that will change over the course of the summer.
We published an article that I know you read by a Slovak volunteer who's fought for Ukraine on 3 separate tours. We're actually having him on The Insider. That episode should come out around the same time this episode comes out. And when he was operating his drones for Ukraine, it was before the mass proliferation of fiber optic drones. But he was saying that these drones were not as effective as people think. We are going to take a quick break from this episode to feature a clip from that Insider episode I recorded with Jakub Jacek, the author of this very skeptical article on FPV drones that has been the most read article on War on the Rocks that we've published this year.
Before the war in Ukraine broke out, I left the military, went back to grad school to try and get a PhD. Then I was working on that when the war broke out, and I just felt very strongly at the time that this was kind of the thing that I had been training for, preparing for throughout my life as a military officer. And if there was ever going to be a time when I needed to put my skills to use, it was now. So I decided to join the Ukrainian military. Like you said, I served 3 separate times. I started out working on surveillance and reconnaissance drones. And to this day, I still think that reconnaissance and surveillance drones are a critical capability, and they really are very important. Every unit in the future is going to have them, and they are changing the battlefield. Strike drones, like I wrote in my article for War on the Rocks, are also an important capability. They've been used to great effect in Ukraine. They will continue to be used in Ukraine and need to be used in Ukraine. But when it comes to strike drones, I think the hype has gotten a little bit ahead of the actual capabilities. It's a question of how much we want to invest in developing this capability. The US probably could figure out better ways to use FPV drones, but how much effort and how much money is it worth? figuring out the better ways to use it. And this is kind of my primary concern, is that everybody will now jump on the drone bandwagon and it will take resources away from existing proven technologies.
And now back to my conversation with Michael Kaufman. What do you make of his argument? And I mean, because what you're describing actually is that these drones are causing serious problems for Ukraine and Russia.
He was using standard FPVs, and to be honest, I get the impression of the article that, look, he had a particularly negative experience because of how his unit was operating and the missions they're trying to perform. It's necessary and relevant corrective, I want to be clear, to the folks who think that drones are just everything and who are just running off of the stat that 70 to 80% of casualties at the front line are inflicted by drones. I would put a couple asterisks next to that statistic, which has an anchoring effect. The truth is that I think fiber optic cable drones and certain other types of drones are most definitely effective. And his experience is sort of one anecdote that was useful to have out there. So that a lot of it depends on force employment and organization.
Training, yeah.
And also, the FPV drones are part of the package. Like, for example, on the Ukrainian side, 50% of the casualties they inflict are with bomber drones, light and heavy multi-rotor, not first-person view strike drones, on average, in most units you talk to. And the two sides have invested much more in different technologies. Ukraine's much better in heavy multi-rotor drones, or maybe certain types of ISR, or maybe short to medium range one-way attack drones.
Like the ones they used on that audacious attack against the Russian bomber fleet a couple months ago or a month ago now.
That's a good example of fairly well thought through operation. You know, Russian military made their own set of investments in a slightly different set of technologies. And so, you know, the parity may be only notional, but in reality, there's significant asymmetries between how the two sides play drones. I would bottom line as Ukraine definitely is better on the integration side in terms of how they employ drones and the quality of their force. Russian military tends to have more.
Yeah, that's one constant we've seen throughout the war is Ukraine is often more innovative, but Russia, once they do innovate, they are much better at scaling their innovations. Do you think that applies here?
They're better at scaling not just production, but sustainment and supply, right? So folks often might miss this in that, yeah, on the one hand, Ukraine might make millions of drones, okay, but a Ukrainian unit, an average unit, might get some percentage, let's say roughly a quarter or a third of their drones delivered to them from the government, from the state. They might get a third from volunteer organizations that contribute or some percentage. And they might get, let's say, a third or quarter drones that they themselves buy from fundraising. They get funding, then they go to
These are notional numbers. You don't know if it's actually a third or...
Well, it'll vary quite a bit. Like an elite unit may get no drones from the government at all. They may do only procurement from a specific supplier because they have the funding and they only want the kind of drone they're going to use. Whereas a poor, regular, drone company supporting a maneuver brigade, maybe most of their drones come from the government.
Whereas Russia's more constant across the force.
Yeah, so part of the reason you'll typically see fewer videos posted by Russian forces because they don't need fundraising nearly as much. And secondarily, they have a much more stable supply. And any Ukrainian drone unit you talk to will tell you that.
Yeah, all those Chinese components are going right to Russia.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Ukrainian drones also use Chinese components, but Russia has much better access, much more stable access. Most importantly, they have much more steady supply provided by the government to these units, even though a lot of them also fundraise and try to get informal assistance. The Russian forces are far less dependent on that than the Ukrainian military.
One thing that the Ukrainian government has been very firm on, which we've both criticized them for, is not being more aggressive in terms of mobilizing manpower, particularly younger manpower. Has that conversation moved at all in recent months?
I think manpower remains one of the biggest problems. And the question out there is, can Ukraine effectively stabilize the front line? And can they make this a futile war for Russia, essentially, make it such that they can't hope to achieve anything without ultimately solving the manpower situation? I'm not saying there's a solution to it, but just looking at it, it remains a consistent issue. So they've tried to recruit more, and I think the situation improved a bit over the winter into the spring, but still quite problematic. Most of the volunteer contract efforts trying to pick up 18, 24-year-olds, they yield very small numbers, Ryan. These are not numbers that change the big picture. I think reducing the number of AWOLs and addressing problems within the force that lead to a higher rate of folks who are absent without leave is a big part of the solution as well, basically stamp the bleeding. But to me, I think manpower is going to be a persistent issue throughout the war for Ukraine. That's just the reality. I think that they are trying to find ways of fighting and adapting to both the challenge posed by the Russian military and also the challenge posed by their manpower situation. And things looked a lot better this winter and spring. Now, however, if you look at the last couple of months, right? So there's no sign of a collapse looming in the Ukrainian military. I think on the one hand, they're not doing that badly.
They're losing territory, but it's not a crisis, is what you're saying.
They're losing territory now at a rather higher rate than they were at this time last year. That's true. But it's not a crisis. And much depends on how the next couple of months go. The way I would put this, there's no summer offensive. The reality is that Russian offensive efforts really renewed early in the spring, and they're not going to stop in the summer. They're probably going to go straight till December. As far as the gains it's making, they're lackluster relative to Russia's material advantages. They're steadily pushing on the same axes they were before. If Ukraine can hold them to relatively low monthly gains, then I think we'll do all right this year.
Well, let's turn to Washington here, because the last U.S. security package won't last forever. So when will Ukraine start feeling the pinch and be unable to sustain its current tempo of operations?
Here's kind of where we are. Biden administration, before they left, I think essentially programmed 6 months or so of PDAs that this administration had been delivering. Probably they're going to get done with that come end of the summer.
Presidential Drawdown Authority, yeah.
Yeah, they still have billions of PDA, but the Trump administration doesn't want to use it. And my impression from that is that they don't want to do it because they don't want this to be their war. Trump keeps saying this is Biden's war that he inherited. And if he starts using Presidential Drawdown Authority and starts sending more equipment and weapons, then policy-wise, it also becomes Trump administration's war. And they've tried to kind of take this approach of, on the one hand, not walking away, but on the other hand, not actually walking towards anything either. And I think that's all going to come to a head this fall because they're going to have to figure out what they want to do. There's no evidence that Russia wants to negotiate. Okay. So when we look at their current approach, it feels like they're steadily winding down material assistance support because they don't want to issue new packages. To do that, they would need to get replenishment funding probably from Congress anyway, or at least depending on what demanded. And then we have this latest crisis that I think was essentially caused by folks in DOD issuing a review of key munitions, looking at U.S. readiness, then suspending deliveries of munitions that were already in Poland that were set to go in Ukraine in this latest tranche. It was a pretty small tranche. By itself, this tranche, I think, doesn't decide much.
But every air defense, especially for Ukraine, counts quite a lot because these missile and drone attacks keep getting larger and larger from Russia.
Yeah, most importantly, it looks really bad because what it does is it sends a signal to Russians that actually, if they just wait long enough, eventually Trump administration is going to wind down support for Ukraine. It doesn't look good for Ukraine either because it looks to them like we're fairly untrustworthy when it comes to even the things we promised to deliver. And I think it's most importantly a problem of process, right? Because it's clear that other parts of the government didn't know, and all this came out late last week and started spiraling out as news to other parts of the U.S. government and to U.S. allies. My own suspicions will probably get resolved, but...
Yeah, I mean, Trump and Zelensky had a call. Zelensky afterwards reported it was the best call he ever had with Trump, although that's not the first time he said that, of course.
To be honest, I think in Kiev that no matter what the call is, they claim it's the best call they ever had. So it might have been a really good call or it might have not been a very good call. But this latest suspension and readiness review, look, it's clear that the folks doing this wanted to send a signal about prioritization and trade-offs, right? So they're using small things like this that actually have no real impact on U.S. readiness at all.
Of course, none of these reviews are ever done when it comes to anything in the Middle East. When it comes to prioritizing Asia, we seem to have a CENTCOM first military strategy and resourcing policy, but Ukraine is, of course, subject to these reviews.
You mean Indo-PACOM and EUCOM, like talking about husbanding resources while CENTCOM looks like they're off at the casino in Vegas spending everybody else's money?
Yeah.
I think it's very fair. And I think that if you look at the tiny amount of munitions in this package, it's clear that primarily bought the USAI, meaning this is new production, not U.S. stocks, wouldn't have had much of an impact on U.S. readiness. It's clear that it's been consumed in a policy decision that folks are trying to drive through in DOD. But look, by itself won't affect Ukraine that much. What I do think is that probably Ukraine, not across all cases and all munitions, I think Ukraine will be fine going into the fall.
But the fall is when it really starts to hurt.
It will. And the biggest issues will be once we get to the fall into the winter of 2026, because it's really not clear what happens after that. And if you want to have a plan of material support, sustainment, you need to get on top of that come August, September.
And Trump doesn't need to go to Congress yet because he still has billions left in Presidential Drawdown Authority. But at some point, if we plan on continuing to support Ukraine, we will need to see this president go to Congress and or we're just going to give up on Ukraine. I mean, those are the options, right?
Well, he's got drawdown authority. What he doesn't have is replenishment funding. So he doesn't have any congressional funding left to buy new things to replace what's being drawn down. The other thing they have is they have billions of dollars they're still churning through of USAI, which is contracts for new production, for parts, for equipment, that they can still use. So my view of it is that they are going to have to decide what they want to do this fall. I suspect that some folks are holding out this unrealistic hope that they'll be able to pressure Russians later this fall, and there's still an opportunity to make a deal, but I'm quite skeptical of that.
How much can Europe make up for the U.S. essentially dropping out of the arming Ukraine operation?
So the biggest question for that is, do we sell them the things that they themselves can't produce that Ukraine needs, right? GMLRS for HIMARS, different types of interceptors for Patriots. If we sell them these capabilities, if we sell them batteries, but most importantly, if we sell them the munitions, then yeah, they can sustain Ukraine. Europe makes enough of artillery ammo, increasingly enough is able to buy it, such that probably it won't be that bad if we get going into 2026. That assumes that we are willing to sell them these things and that we are willing to continue directing some significant percentage of new production to Ukraine's war effort via, let's say, Europe, or if Europe provides the money to Ukraine to buy it, or if Europe buys on behalf of Ukraine. I mean, Ukrainians are happy with whichever.
And this is quite
option.
a change, because earlier in the war, it would have been unrealistic to even under that situation to even talk about Europe supporting Ukraine without the U.S. still being in the lead. But you're saying that's changed now.
It has changed. And I think that the U.S.'s position has been, based under this administration, that they want to shift as much of the burden as they can onto Europeans, both financial and, most importantly, material when it comes to munitions. And in a number of areas, Europe can actually increasingly take over and provide Ukraine what it needs, in part because also Ukraine needs a lot less in general because it can produce a lot on its own, certainly drones, drone munitions, what have you. And the rest simply depends on whether the United States is willing to sell at a sufficient rate. The challenge there will be stability of supply. Because if the U.S. isn't willing to provide some stable supply of these capabilities, then Ukraine is going to be going through months of plenty and then periods of real deficit and hunger in terms of precision strike capabilities, air defense interceptors. And I don't mean now in the coming months, but I mean if you look out 6, 8, 12 months down the line.
Well, and this all goes back to our own resourcing of our defense industrial base. You know, Trump wants this $1 trillion budget and is touting this as higher than ever. And in terms of dollars and cents, it is. But our purchasing power has been reduced from tariffs, the state of our economy, the health of the dollar. So that $1 trillion really, it's essentially the Biden budget and maybe even a bit less is my assessment. So we're going to need to see the administration get a lot more aggressive on resourcing orders in our defense industrial base than I think they're currently willing to do.
Yeah, and Europeans also are going to have to pick up a lot of the slack for the U.S., I think, moving forward in this war. Because if we look at kind of their plans for increased defense spending, I think they can get on top of procurement, but building up capacity in their militaries and even getting towards this 3.5% pledge that they made all the way out to 2035 or whatever it is. It's going to be a stretch for some countries. So Europe also, I think, has a lot of work ahead of itself. But the biggest challenge at the end of the day is, let's say there's no ceasefire, there is no kind of durable agreement, which I think is more than likely now. Ukrainian leadership is increasingly kind of planning around this, that this war is going to be sustained at some level for the foreseeable future. It's not clear that everybody else understands that yet. That's the worst case scenario, and that's the plan that a lot of folks are going with because there's no evidence that Russia wants to negotiate.
I mean, as we discussed earlier, Russia believes, and not without evidence, that they can just wait out Trump and Trump will get tired of supporting Ukraine, and that's a pretty dark future for Ukraine. So why would Russia negotiate if they have this evidence that, well, it's true that ties between Zelensky and Trump have certainly improved since that disastrous Oval Office meeting, but what are the actual results? We still have yet to find that out.
Yeah, I think we tried to cover this issue on a recent episode of Russia Contingency with Steve Kotkin.
I'm just going to let Mike and Steve Kotkin speak for themselves, so we're going to do a quick excerpt from that episode of the Russia Contingency.
Putin himself doesn't care that he denies Russia its future, too. If he did, he would have never run Russia this way to begin with, right? This isn't the future he cares about. In fact, if anything, you'd probably be a better person to comment on this. He seems to care much more about the past than he does about the future.
this has been my point now for a really long time, that Russia doesn't need Ukraine, ultimately. Russia has Russia. Ukraine needs Ukraine. So Russia's failure to attain its maximalist objectives is still a win if it ruins Ukraine in the meantime. If it wrecks Ukraine or prevents Ukraine from a flourishing future, that's a version of a win for the Russian side. So the ingenuity and the courage and the adaptability and the Western support, all of it impressive as it is not enough to prevent this version of a Russian victory, which is let's wreck Ukraine. If I can't have it, nobody can have it. And so that's, I think, still the challenge. How we get to a place where Ukraine can become Ukraine, the kind of Ukraine that it aspires to be, a flourishing Ukraine, and Russia can then be forced to face the choices that its leadership has made and how it's mortgaged its future on behalf of a failed, murderous criminal escapade. But the shock here for some people is that when Putin was offered a version of victory, a very favorable armistice, more favorable than Ukraine certainly has been ready to grant all of these years, that Putin turned it down. I mean, just this past spring, President Trump came forward with an offer that you could only characterize as highly favorable to Russia. Putin's not going to get everything he wanted, but he was going to get quite a lot more than he's achieved on the battlefield. And yet he spurned the offer. And he spurned it in a way that you would think would have made Trump quite angry. In a way, he humiliated Trump. And Trump was briefly angry, importantly. But here we are where Putin continues to prosecute the maximalist aims and refuses to take the win that was put on the table. So it's not clear to me that Putin will accept a ceasefire of any kind.
And now back to my conversation with Mike. Thank you for listening to War on the Rocks. You can listen to Mike's show, The Russia Contingency, Afshon Ostovar's new show, The Insider. You can listen to my interview with our Slovakian friend who volunteered for Ukrainian forces and served in a drone unit. You can listen to all this by becoming a member at War on the Rocks. I have to warn you, in just a few weeks, the price of our annual membership and monthly membership is going to be going up pretty substantially. So if you haven't become a member yet, now is a really good time to do it. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.